March 1945, Luzon. The sun sits low and heavy over a landscape still scarred by artillery and burned-out trucks, the air thick with diesel, sweat, and the faint copper tang of recent blood. Under American guard, a small column of Japanese army nurses and clerks were marched toward a temporary POW compound. They had been rounded up after the fall of Manila in early March and expected interrogation, humiliation, or worse. Instead, they found neat rows of bell tents, a tented dispensary where medics administered sulfur and morphine, rationed Red Cross chocolate, and a makeshift library under palm fronds where captives and guards alike leafed through novels and newspapers. The sight produced a stunned, almost audible silence among many of the women, whose training had prepared them for death, not civility from the enemy. To understand how such a palm-shaded reading room appeared in the middle of a bloody campaign, we step backward through policy and supply. By late 1944 and into 1945, island-hopping operations had begun to produce larger numbers of prisoners, and U.S. commanders attached civil affairs and special services detachments to newly secured areas. Special services, responsible for troop morale and recreation, adapted quickly. Officers reclaimed books from base libraries, requisitioned motion picture projectors and phonographs, and organized classes and small libraries wherever transport allowed. The global logistics machine, Liberty ships moving tons of supplies across the Pacific, LSTs and transports unloading at makeshift jetties, and C-47s moving personnel between islands, created the flow necessary to stock tents with food, medical supplies, and reading material. Those administrative and logistical choices collided with a different, deeper force: Japanese socialization into Bushido and an official propaganda ecosystem that had equated capture with disgrace. Contemporary camp reports from March and April 1945 record repeated scenes of astonishment as prisoners, conditioned to expect cruelty, received medical care, newspapers, and classes in English. Civil affairs officers noted that the surprise itself often undercut resistance and opened channels for communication and re-education. Some historians argue this treatment was an explicit policy of soft power. Others see it as pragmatic improvisation by officers confronting the realities of occupation. Whatever the intent, the combination of organized care, the American transport network, and the cultural shock of humane treatment made the Luzon reading room possible, and it became a small but telling preface to the larger effort to win not only the war but the peace that followed. By mid-1944, Japan's empire was beginning to contract under the relentless pressure of Allied counterattacks, yet its war doctrine only hardened. The Imperial Japanese Army's manuals and officer lectures repeated one commandment with ritual certainty: death before dishonor. For women in uniform, the rule was no different. Within the Medical and Communications Corps alone, nearly 30,000 women served across the Philippines, Burma, and the Pacific Islands, trained not merely as nurses or clerks, but as extensions of the warrior spirit. Their instructors told them that surrender to Americans meant torture, rape, or vivisection in laboratories. Propaganda leaflets and military radio broadcasts warned that to be captured was to lose one's soul. Under this conditioning, even the idea of captivity became an unthinkable rupture with family and nation. That summer, as the tide of war turned in the Marianas, the taboo met its first great test. On Guam in August 1944, U.S. Marines advancing through the hills of Fonte and Agat encountered women in tattered field uniforms among the remnants of the 54th Kabutai Communications Unit. Some had attempted to detonate grenades against themselves rather than submit. Others, bleeding from shrapnel wounds and half-starved, were taken alive and sat trembling as medics approached. American reports described their disbelief when treated with bandages instead of bayonets. Many refused food, convinced it was poisoned. A Marine interpreter recalled one captive who wept hysterically when given water, as if the gesture were a trick. For Japanese command back in Tokyo, such accounts were suppressed. To admit their existence would puncture the image of the invincible, self-sacrificing soldier. When the U.S. Sixth Army landed on Leyte in October and later advanced on Luzon, hundreds more women were trapped amid collapsing garrisons. Some fled into the jungle and perished. Others, too weak to resist, were captured near Tacloban and later Manila. Their interrogations revealed the full reach of indoctrination. Years of compulsory moral training in schools, spiritual drills invoking the emperor's divinity, and films that depicted Allied troops as demons. Surrender, they had been told, would bring eternal shame to their ancestors. Yet the reality that confronted them, a doctor offering quinine, a sentry sharing cigarettes, stood in unbearable contrast. To these women, the moment of capture was not merely military defeat, but the collapse of a lifelong moral architecture. For American officers, the reactions of these prisoners offered a stark window into the psychology of an enemy raised on Bushido. Intelligence summaries from early 1945 remarked that female captives showed the same fatalism as their male counterparts, but responded more rapidly to acts of kindness. Some even began teaching Japanese to guards, or assisting with the wounded, behaviors once deemed impossible. Their existence embodied Japan's ideological crisis, a militarized culture colliding with the pragmatic mercy of its adversary. What began as a personal shock would soon evolve into policy, the codified framework through which the U.S. Army and Navy determined how every prisoner, male or female, Axis or Allied, would be treated under American command. By early 1945, as the Pacific War reached its blood-soaked crescendo, the U.S. military's approach to handling Axis prisoners had already diverged sharply from the chaos of combat. It was a policy rooted in law but wielded as strategy. The 1929 Geneva Convention, ratified by Washington though ignored by Tokyo, outlined the minimum standards for humane treatment of prisoners: food, shelter, medical care, and protection from violence. American policymakers, led by the War Department and advised by the Office of War Information, saw in those rules more than moral obligation. They saw a psychological weapon. If Japan fought under a creed that glorified death and demonized surrender, then each act of decency shown to a captive was an assault on that creed's foundation. The psychological warfare branch urged that kindness be used with precision to show prisoners that democracy, not fear, governed the victors. General Douglas MacArthur, directing operations across the Southwest Pacific area, absorbed these principles with his characteristic mix of discipline and symbolism. He ordered that all prisoner-of-war enclosures, even temporary jungle stockades, meet sanitary standards comparable to those of Allied camps. Field engineers laid out drainage ditches, bamboo showers, and canvas infirmaries beside the same roads where Japanese columns had once marched to battle. Medical officers logged vaccination and ration data, ensuring documentation that could withstand scrutiny by neutral observers. To the American command, these measures were not mere bureaucracy. They were demonstrations of order amid destruction, proof that civilization could still be practiced within sight of burned villages. Yet the moral calculus extended beyond hygiene and rations. Wherever transport and time allowed, special services units distributed reading materials, field manuals, back issues of Life and Collier's, even tattered novels from base libraries in Australia and Hawaii. In larger compounds near Tacloban and Baguio, engineers improvised small reading huts from palm wood and corrugated tin. Within them, Japanese women from the Communications and Nursing Corps, once schooled in Bushido and emperor worship, found themselves staring at books filled with the English alphabet or photographs of American families. Reports from camp officers noted the astonishment such objects provoked. Many had never held a Western publication before, one lieutenant wrote. They studied the faces in the magazines as though decoding an alien species. For the U.S. military, this was precisely the point. The humane environment, clean camps, steady rations, accessible reading, was not a spontaneous gesture of goodwill, but an instrument of reorientation. Intelligence officers understood that information flowed more freely from prisoners who felt respected than from those who feared retaliation. The women arriving from Leyte, Manila, or Baguio had no idea that their captors' compassion was part of a larger psychological framework, crafted to erode indoctrination while gathering intelligence. To them, the contrast between propaganda and experience was disorienting, even shattering. Where they expected punishment, they found quiet order. Where they expected degradation, they found structure and books. Still, these ideals strained under the realities of war. The next phase of the story would unfold not in planned compounds, but on the volatile edge of the front line, where doctrine met exhaustion, disease and vengeance, and where even the best-intentioned policies were tested against the chaos of battle. October 1944. Leyte Island lay under a sky torn by artillery smoke and the thunder of naval guns. As U.S. Sixth Army troops pressed inland from the beaches at Palo and Dulag, they overran shattered remnants of Japanese medical stations. Among the wreckage of bamboo huts and burned supply dumps, soldiers from the 24th Infantry Division found the unthinkable. Women in tattered khaki, some wearing Red Cross armbands, crouched beside the wounded. These were members of the Imperial Army Medical Service, field nurses who had been ordered to tend casualties until the last man fell. Many had gone days without food. When captured, several tried to apologize to their captors, expecting punishment. Instead, American medics lifted them onto stretchers and carried them to aid posts. It was the first time most had been touched without violence since their arrival in the Philippines. The initial count was fewer than 30 women, malnourished, dehydrated, and in some cases suffering from malaria or shrapnel wounds. Their treatment began in a makeshift triage tent near Tacloban, where American and Filipino nurses disinfected cuts and offered quinine and broth. Witnesses later recalled the prisoners' silent astonishment when men they had been told were devils bandaged their arms. Within days, the women were moved to a rear area compound inland from the beachhead. Their standard procedure replaced improvisation, registration, medical inspection, and assignment to a guarded enclosure. To the Americans, this was a small but symbolic demonstration of control, proof that even amid chaos, the Geneva rules still applied. Colonel Clyde Childress, a medical officer attached to the 24th Infantry Division, filed one of the earliest reports on the encounter. His notes, later circulated through the Sixth Army's Civil Affairs Office, described the prisoners' bewildered gratitude as they received Red Cross parcels containing soap, tinned food and English-language pamphlets. A few women used dictionaries to puzzle over simple phrases. Others clutched small writing pads included in the parcels, uncertain whether they were permitted to use them. To American observers, the scene carried clear propaganda value, a living rebuttal to Japan's depiction of Allied cruelty. The photographs that accompanied Childress's report, now preserved in U.S. Army archives, show neat rows of tents and nurses smiling faintly beside Filipino orderlies. The chaos of the battlefield pushed just beyond the frame. This early contact at Tacloban became the template for handling subsequent female prisoners on Luzon and later Okinawa. Commanders learned that predictable routine, regular meals, medical rounds, and access to reading materials produced cooperation and valuable intelligence. Behind the civility, however, lay calculated strategy. Every act of order served to contrast American discipline with Japanese fanaticism. As the campaign advanced toward Japan's home islands, the camp system grew in complexity, overseen by the U.S. military government's prisoner-of-war branch. Temporary stockades gave way to permanent compounds with clerical staff, translators, and visiting Red Cross officers. For the Japanese women who passed through them, the experience was both disorienting and revelatory, a glimpse of a moral universe their training had denied existed. What began in the mud of Leyte would soon expand into a network of camps whose quiet order stood in sharp relief against the burning Pacific. February 1945, Manila, once called the Pearl of the Orient, had become a graveyard of stone and smoke. U.S. forces advancing through the shattered capital met fanatical resistance from the Imperial, Japanese Army and Navy units that refused to surrender. Entire districts burned under artillery fire. When the fighting finally ended in March, the city lay flattened, its churches gutted, and its river choked with wreckage. Amid the devastation, Allied troops began rounding up survivors of the defeated garrison. Among the prisoners were hundreds of Japanese women, nurses from field hospitals, clerks from supply depots, and communications operators from the 14th Area Army. Many emerged from cellars or makeshift shelters, pale with exhaustion, clutching small bundles of possessions. They had been told capture meant degradation. Instead, American medics and Filipino volunteers handed them water, food, and clean uniforms. The newly created Allied Prisoner-of-War Reception Group, operating under the U.S. Sixth Army, took over several intact Japanese barracks north of Intramuros and converted them into organized compounds. The layout was practical but also symbolic. Fences repaired, latrines dug, infirmaries reopened under new management. Filipino nurses joined American officers in administering medical care, while interpreters processed the prisoners for transport to larger camps. Inside one such compound, a signboard written in both English and Japanese outlined daily routines: roll call, meals, hygiene, and classes. For women who had lived under the chaos of siege, the restoration of order felt almost unreal. It was within these repurposed spaces that a quiet transformation began. The Americans, guided by recommendations from the Office of War Information and the Psychological Warfare Branch, introduced small-scale educational programs, language instruction, literacy lessons, and libraries stocked with donated books. The reading material ranged from simple English primers and grammar guides to translated agricultural manuals, health pamphlets, and even copies of Reader's Digest. Each volume served a dual purpose: practical rehabilitation and subtle persuasion. Education provided structure, reduced tension, and, most importantly, suggested that knowledge, not obedience, was the foundation of strength. Intelligence officers observed that prisoners who engaged with the reading material grew more cooperative, asking questions about American schools and women's lives rather than repeating military slogans. For Japanese women who had memorized the imperial rescript on education, a moral catechism demanding loyalty, filial piety, and unquestioning devotion to the emperor, the discovery that their enemies placed equal faith in learning was profoundly destabilizing. In camp diaries later recovered by Allied intelligence, several wrote of bewilderment at the absence of propaganda and punishment. One former nurse recorded, "They teach English as if we are students, not prisoners." The presence of books, objects they had once associated with national duty and censorship, became symbols of something alien yet magnetic. It was not victory through conquest, but persuasion through intellect. By late March, reports from Manila's compounds reached higher headquarters. Noting a consistent pattern, hostility diminished when reading replaced lecturing. What had begun as an improvised measure for morale soon appeared to hold deeper promise. For American planners, this realization marked a turning point. If humane order and access to education could soften enemy resistance in a ruined city, then perhaps those same principles could guide Japan's eventual reconstruction. The next stage would formalize this experiment, transforming ad hoc camp libraries into the first deliberate instruments of re-education policy across the Pacific. By the end of 1945, as Japan lay in ruins and Allied occupation began, the emotional reverberations of captivity surfaced through words rather than weapons. The Allied Translator and Interpreter Section, ATIS, headquartered in Tokyo and Manila, dispatched teams of linguists and psychologists to interview Japanese prisoners returning from camps across the Pacific. Among them were dozens of women, former nurses from Cebu and Leyte, clerks from Baguio, and communications operators once stationed on Guam. Their testimonies, recorded in careful detail, revealed astonishment rather than resentment. One nurse, repatriated from Hawaii, told her interviewer she had imagined chains, not classrooms. Another described how the simple presence of an English-Japanese dictionary in her barracks felt like forgiveness written in paper. For women trained to expect annihilation upon capture, the realization that the enemy valued literacy and order more than vengeance. Struck with the force of revelation, ATIS analysts categorized such responses as evidence of rapid ideological dissipation. The reports, later forwarded to the Psychological Warfare Bureau, outlined a consistent emotional trajectory: initial terror at surrender, disbelief during the first days of humane treatment, cautious acceptance after exposure to reading materials, and finally curiosity about American life. Prisoners often spoke of confusion turning into self-reflection. A former typist from Manila confessed she had begun to question her wartime training only when she saw American guards attending English classes taught by Japanese prisoners themselves. "They asked us to teach them our words," she recalled, "and I realized they were human." These moments of reciprocal learning, guards practicing hiragana while prisoners struggled with English, became quiet acts of reconciliation within barbed wire boundaries. For Allied intelligence, such transformations held quantifiable value. Psychological officers noted that voluntary cooperation increased sharply in camps with structured libraries and language programs. Prisoners were more forthcoming in debriefings, less prone to collective resistance, and more receptive to post-war repatriation instructions. Humane treatment, once defended as moral duty, now proved tactically effective. A 1946 ATIS memorandum concluded that emotional conversion achieved through non-coercive exposure is more durable than imposed. Confession. What had begun as an experiment in civility had evolved into a field-tested model for reshaping belief systems. American commanders, reading these assessments amid the continuing bloodshed of Okinawa, saw vindication of their earlier gamble. They had fought a war against fanaticism, and here in the quiet testimonies of captured women was measurable proof that ideas could accomplish what bombardment could not. The reports fed into occupation planning meetings in Manila and Honolulu, reinforcing the conviction that education, not punishment, would secure Japan's future stability. The contrast between the noise of ongoing combat and the calm introspection of these interviews symbolized the transition now underway, from war to re-education, from conquest to persuasion. The narrative next shifts from the level of individual emotion to the institutional, examining how military administrators codified these findings into policy as the Pacific Campaign entered its final, catastrophic stage. 9 ChatGPT said, April 1945, Okinawa. The last and bloodiest battle of the Pacific opened beneath monsoon clouds and the thunder of naval bombardment. Hillsides erupted under American artillery, villages burned, and civilians fled into limestone caves as the U.S. 10th Army advanced inland. By May, entire communities lay shattered. Yet amid the slaughter, a quieter struggle unfolded, one that tested not firepower but conviction. Hundreds of Japanese women, many from the Women's Volunteer Nursing Corps, were captured in the chaos. They had been trained to die beside their patients, to carry grenades for self-destruction rather than face capture. American soldiers found them in caves tending to the wounded or wandering alone through shell-pocked fields. Their uniforms scorched, their expressions hollow from exhaustion. Propaganda had promised that Americans would torture them. Instead, medics offered quinine and water. For the U.S. command, Okinawa became the proving ground for policies first tested on Leyte and refined in Manila. The 10th Army's Civil Affairs Division, working under extreme battlefield conditions, insisted that humane standards remain intact. Prisoner collection points at Yomitan and Nago were hastily organized using commandeered schoolhouses and warehouses. Inside, Army nurses and Navy corpsmen treated burns and dysentery, while psychological officers set up rudimentary reading corners. Navy chaplains, scavenging through the ruins of local schools, salvaged Japanese textbooks and storybooks, supplementing them with bilingual pamphlets, and donated English readers, shipped from Guam. It was an improvised continuation of the experiment begun months earlier, using books as instruments of stability in the midst of ruin. Reports filed by the Civil Affairs Division in late May 1945 recorded unexpected outcomes. Literacy activities reduced incidents of panic and violence among prisoners. Women who had once resisted identification procedures began requesting writing materials, asking to label supplies in both languages or to practice English letters on scrap paper. Guards observed that reading aloud, particularly when done cooperatively by Japanese and Filipino interpreters, transformed the camp atmosphere. One officer wrote that discipline improves when silence becomes study. For the Americans, this was not sentimental idealism, but evidence that psychological control could be maintained without coercion. To Japanese prisoners, the experience was profoundly disorienting. The very objects of their wartime devotion, the emperor's portrait, the imperial rescript, the flag, had been replaced by ink, paper, and foreign words. Books, once tools of indoctrination, now symbolized survival. Women who had sworn to die for honor were instead learning to write their names in Roman letters or translate medical labels for their captors. The cultural shock was complete and irreversible. In camp journals preserved by the 10th Army's historical section, one nurse described the moment she realized "The enemy teaches us, not punishes us." Another wrote that she began to dream of rebuilding, not dying. By the battle's end in June 1945, nearly 100,000 Japanese civilians were dead, and Okinawa lay pulverized. Yet within its temporary POW enclosures flickered the first outlines of a different Japan, one shaped by education, literacy, and exposure rather than obedience. For American planners, Okinawa's camps confirmed that psychological warfare could operate through kindness as effectively as through force. The lessons gathered there, measured in notebooks, reading lists, and the hesitant English words of former enemies, would soon be codified into the occupation's administrative blueprint. The next section follows that transition. How the end of the Pacific War transformed these battlefield experiments in humane captivity into the guiding principles of America's post-war re-education policy. August 15, 1945, Japan's surrender. Across the Pacific, the guns fell silent, and in hundreds of American-run compounds the news spread from interpreter to prisoner in stunned disbelief. For the Japanese women held at Honolulu, Guam, and Luzon, the war's end meant more than release. It meant the beginning of an unexpected transformation. The same libraries and classrooms that had once served as instruments of wartime psychological warfare now became models for peace. General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters, established in Tokyo as the supreme commander for the Allied powers, GHQ SCAP, faced the monumental task of remaking an entire nation. Amid the rubble, his staff sought policies that could reach hearts as well as institutions. The humane treatment of Axis prisoners, particularly the education-oriented approach developed in Pacific POW camps, offered an immediate blueprint. Reports from the Prisoner of War Branch, the Psychological Warfare Bureau, and the Civil Affairs Division all emphasized a consistent finding: exposure to Western reading material, coupled with respect and order, eroded militarism faster than coercion ever could. Within months, this philosophy took bureaucratic form. The Civil Information and Education Section, CIE, created under SCAP, adapted wartime camp strategies for national use. Where reading tents once stood behind barbed wire, new public libraries reopened in Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya. American donated textbooks, children's readers, and translations of democratic works flooded the shelves. Schools reintroduced critical thinking and civic education, while women, long excluded from intellectual and political life, were explicitly encouraged to pursue higher learning. The same logic that had guided the distribution of English dictionaries in Luzon now guided the establishment of women's universities in Tokyo. Former female POWs returning through Yokohama and Kure became living embodiments of this transition. Interviewed by Japanese journalists and occupation officials, they spoke of humane captors, clean camps, and access to books, accounts that defied years of imperial propaganda. Their testimonies circulated quietly in post-war Japan, reinforcing the message that American power derived not solely from weapons, but from moral discipline and intellectual freedom. Intelligence summaries compiled in September 1945 by the Civil Affairs and Military Government divisions explicitly cited the library effect as a tool of demythologization. The exposure to foreign literature, they noted, had broken the moral monopoly of the imperial myth. Thus, the ideals that had governed the treatment of a few hundred women behind fences now shaped the education of millions. The re-education of Japan was not an abrupt invention of occupation policy. It was the logical continuation of the humane systems refined in wartime captivity. What began as an experiment in psychological warfare evolved into a national philosophy of democratic rehabilitation. Yet beyond the strategic calculations lay a deeper human legacy. For the women who had once been enemies, the memory of reading by lantern light in distant camps, of turning the pages of Robinson Crusoe or an English dictionary, remained indelible. They returned to a homeland in ruins, but carried with them the realization that knowledge could transcend defeat. The next section turns to that legacy, how these women, once prisoners of war, became early participants in Japan's intellectual and moral reconstruction. Between September 1945 and the spring of 1946, the Pacific witnessed one of the quietest yet most consequential migrations of the war's aftermath. the mass repatriation of Japanese prisoners of war. Aboard ships like the USS General Gordon and USS Admiral Capps, thousands of men and women who had once served the Empire began the long voyage home. Among them were several hundred female prisoners from Guam, Hawaii, and the Philippines, former nurses, clerks, and radio operators who had spent months under American custody. The U.S. Navy's Repatriation Command issued clear orders: return them with dignity. On deck, Red Cross workers distributed reading material and music records. Many women continued studying English or medicine using camp-issued books, a routine that had become a quiet habit of survival. At the reception centers in Yokohama, Kure, and Maizuru, Allied interpreters and Japanese welfare officials conducted interviews designed both to screen and to learn. Again and again, the same tone of astonishment appeared in transcripts: disbelief that Americans had permitted them to read freely, to study, to exist as individuals rather than conquered enemies. One nurse from Cebu recalled, "They gave us novels and notebooks instead of punishment. I could not understand it." Another, from Guam, described her return home as more confusing than captivity, because her countrymen refused to believe her accounts of humane treatment. These testimonies carried enormous social weight in a society struggling to reconcile defeat with survival. For many civilians who had never seen an American, the repatriated women became accidental ambassadors of a different moral order. Their stories undermined years of wartime propaganda that had portrayed Westerners as sadists and brutes. In conversations at temples, markets, and new civic centers, they spoke of American doctors teaching hygiene, chaplains organizing reading circles, and guards who bowed instead of shouted. Through such anecdotes, the unimaginable became tangible. The enemy had been disciplined, educated, and humane. This diffusion of lived experience aligned perfectly with the U.S. occupation's broader psychological strategy. Without formal coordination, these women became informal educators, transmitting lessons learned behind barbed wire into the heart of Japan's civilian life. Many joined post-war literacy movements promoted by the Civil Information and Education Section, CIE, helping organize women's reading clubs, language classes, and civic study groups. Their first-hand experiences of fairness and learning under American supervision lent authenticity to the message of reform that official propaganda could never fully achieve. The emotional continuity between wartime, captivity, and peacetime reconstruction was no accident. It reflected the strategic foresight of U.S. policy architects who understood that moral victory could outlast military conquest. By proving through action that democracy valued intellect and compassion, the Americans had planted ideological seeds that the occupation would later cultivate into Japan's cultural and educational renaissance. From the reading huts of Luzon to the libraries of Tokyo, the same principle endured. Power exercised through respect transforms both victor and vanquished. The next section examines how these individual memories intertwined with Japan's early post-war intellectual revival, the rebirth of publishing, education, and women's social participation that reshaped an entire civilization's relationship with knowledge. By 1947, amid the ruins of bombed-out cities and the slow hum of rebuilding, Japan's Ministry of Education, operating under the supervision of General MacArthur's Civil Information and Education Section, launched an ambitious national program to restore the country's library system. Thousands of public and school libraries had been destroyed by air raids, their shelves reduced to ash and warped metal. Yet from that devastation emerged a new ethos. Knowledge itself would become the foundation of peace. The initiative was not merely administrative, but ideological, part of a deliberate plan to reshape how the Japanese understood authority, citizenship, and truth. Within this movement, several former female POWs, once captives in Guam, Leyte, and Honolulu, quietly took positions as translators, clerks, and reference assistants in newly reopened reading rooms, archival correspondence. From the United States Information Service, USIS, reveals how carefully this intellectual reconstruction was modeled on lessons learned from wartime captivity. American cultural officers coordinated shipments of books remarkably similar to those distributed in Pacific POW camps: abridged English classics, bilingual dictionaries, agricultural guides, and works explaining constitutional democracy. Each shipment was catalogued not as propaganda, but as educational donation, intended to build bridges rather than impose ideology. The titles chosen, Robinson Crusoe, Democracy in America, Walden, and translated works of Lincoln's speeches, carried symbolic weight. They echoed the moral logic of those earlier reading tents, where Japanese women had first encountered the paradox of humane enemies and freedom through study. In Tokyo and Osaka, new libraries opened inside repurposed government buildings, their walls lined with both Japanese and English texts. Visitors recalled the uncanny familiarity of certain donated volumes, identical in design to those once read behind barbed wire in the tropics. For the women who had lived that earlier experience, these spaces represented not just recovery, but continuity, a proof that intellectual life could persist even through collapse. One former Army nurse, now a library assistant, later wrote that, "The smell of new books reminded me of the camp at Guam, where I first learned that reading could heal shame." Such recollections blurred the boundary between occupation policy and personal redemption. Culturally, the transformation was profound. In the wartime empire, obedience had been the supreme virtue. By the late 1940s, learning itself became a moral act. The act of entering a library, open to all, no uniform required, symbolized liberation from dogma. American educators recognized the irony. The same system once devised to pacify prisoners had evolved into the moral architecture of a democracy. What began as psychological warfare had matured into cultural diplomacy. For many Japanese, especially women, the revival of libraries signified a deeper truth. Enlightenment was not a privilege granted by victory, but a resilience of the human spirit. Those who had once turned pages under guard now guided others toward intellectual freedom. The memory of books found behind barbed wire became more than a personal anecdote. It stood as quiet proof that compassion, when institutionalized, could rebuild nations. As the decade closed, the hum of reading rooms replaced the echoes of war. The next and final section returns to where the story began, to that moment in Luzon when astonished eyes first met the sight of books beneath palm fronds, and reflects on how that single image came to define the moral legacy of the Pacific, warthood in the decades that followed the war. The curious experiment of the POW libraries drew the attention of both historians and military psychologists. By the early 1950s, analysts within the U.S. Army's strategic bombing survey, particularly its moral division, had begun to treat the Pacific prisoner program not merely as a logistical achievement, but as an exercise in applied psychology. Their reports concluded that humane treatment had produced quantifiable changes in Japanese morale, even among prisoners steeped in the absolutism of Bushido. The contrast was striking. Where Japanese camps had relied on degradation to enforce control, American camps had achieved stability through structure, literacy, and dignity. Declassified data decades later confirmed the hue trend. 92% of Japanese POWs interviewed described their treatment as better than expected, a statistical echo of astonishment first recorded on the beaches of Leyte and Luzon. These numbers, though deceptively clinical, carried moral weight. The analysts argued that the differential between expectation and experience created a psychological breach, a sudden collapse of enemy propaganda and the birth of doubt. Within Japan's defeated officer corps, post-war interrogations revealed a secondary effect, the awareness that their own cruelty had not only dishonored the emperor's cause, but legitimized the enemy's claim to moral superiority. Historians later observed that this inversion of values helped accelerate Japan's acceptance of Allied occupation reforms, framing them not as impositions, but as corrections to national shame. The female POW experience occupied a special place in these assessments. Intelligence officers noted that women, as custodians of family and education in Japanese society, became critical transmitters of new values upon repatriation. Exposure to American notions of fairness, literacy, and self-expression had reconfigured their sense of moral agency. When these women re-entered civilian life, They carried those lessons into classrooms, libraries, and civic groups, often unconsciously continuing the work that had begun behind barbed wire. In this sense, the POW library policy was more than an act of mercy. It was a blueprint for ideological transformation without violence. By the 1960s, the concept had been folded into Cold War doctrine under new terminology: psychological operations, civic action, winning hearts and minds. Yet as the United States entered Korea and later Vietnam, few of these campaigns matched the subtlety or ethical coherence of the Pacific experiment. Where later wars relied on loud propaganda and forced re-education, the wartime camps had succeeded through quiet consistency, books, conversation, and the demonstration of restraint. Analysts reviewing the program in the 1970s called it the moral precedent of the Pacific, a rare instance where compassion, wielded deliberately, achieved strategic ends. In retrospect, the victory was not only military but perceptual. America's conduct toward its prisoners became evidence of a civilization confident enough to lead by example. The libraries, the literacy classes, the small courtesies of medical care, all had functioned as instruments of persuasion stronger than punishment or fear. As the historians concluded, the ultimate triumph of the Pacific War was not only that Japan surrendered, but that it learned through experience that mercy could command obedience more effectively than terror. The narrative now turns toward its closing reflection, back to the humid camps of Luzon, where a single shelf of books beneath palm fronds revealed the strange, disarming power of humanity in the midst of total war. The story ends where it began, in that quiet camp on Luzon, where the air shimmered with heat and the scent of palm resin clung to the dust. There, women once sworn to die for the emperor now sat cross-legged beneath the sun, turning the thin, borrowed pages of English books. What they encountered was not indulgence or weakness, but a deliberate assertion of moral strength. The Americans had constructed those small libraries behind barbed wire, not merely to pass the time, but to rebuild minds, proof that victory could be exercised through compassion as well as command. For the Japanese women who survived, that moment of discovery became the beginning of an inner transformation, the first reconciliation with the unbearable idea of defeat. Their astonishment, quietly shared in hundreds of similar camps from Guam to Hawaii, marked an uncelebrated triumph in the broader war for ideas. When Japan later rebuilt itself into a democracy, those early encounters persisted in memory, faint but formative, reminding both victor and vanquished that civilization is measured not by the force of its arms, but by its regard for the conquered. In the end, the simplest image remained: a prisoner reading beneath a palm tree, the wire glinting behind her. In that fragile space, knowledge had done what weapons could not. It had liberated the soul.